The bell tower tolled midnight as Sister Isabella pressed her trembling hands against the cold convent gates. The iron was slick with dew, and the chill seeped through her thin fingers, but she pushed anyway. The hinges gave a soft groan, one she prayed the other sisters would not hear. Her heart pounded as though it would betray her, echoing louder than the bells themselves. Behind her lay the convent walls, gray stone, strict vows, and a life she had sworn to God but could no longer endure. Ahead lay the wilderness, dark and unknown. She tightened her grip on the small satchel hanging from her shoulder. Inside were only bread, a small flask of water, and the rosary she hadn't yet found the courage to leave behind. She glanced once more at the cross above the chapel roof. A whisper of guilt stabbed through her chest. "Forgive me," she thought. But the weight of secrets, the real reason for her escape, drove her onward. Secrets the Mother Superior would never forgive. The convent had been her home since girlhood. She had taken vows at 16, her voice steady, her eyes lowered. The sisters had called her devout. But as the years passed, Isabella's prayers brought her less comfort. Shadows pressed against her heart, the suffocating rules, the whispered judgments, and the quiet, gnawing hunger for something beyond cloistered walls. And then the mistake. One that left her branded in her own conscience. Certain she could never face her sisters again. Now she was a fugitive, not only from vows but from the life that had caged her spirit. The dirt path beneath her sandals felt unfamiliar, almost forbidden. Every step into the night tasted like both freedom and sin. She moved quickly, keeping her eyes on the ground, her breath tight. Behind her she imagined voices calling her name, footsteps in pursuit. But there was only silence, the heavy, waiting silence of the desert night. The moonlight cast long shadows across the land. Crickets chirped, and somewhere in the distance a coyote's cry pierced the air. Isabella shivered, pulling her cloak tighter. She had never been beyond the convent walls alone. Fear pressed against her ribs, but the thought of turning back was worse. Hours passed, her sandals scraping against rock and dirt. At last, the faint sound of rushing water reached her ears. Relief flickered in her chest. She knew from whispered stories that a river wound through this land, a path toward the mountains and, perhaps, safety. She followed the sound, quickening her pace until the trees thinned and silver light reflected off churning waves below. The river was swollen from spring rains, its current wild and unforgiving. Still, she pressed forward. On the far side lay escape. If she could cross, she would put miles between herself and pursuit. She searched the bank, finding a line of stones that jutted above the water. They formed a crude path toward the other shore. Fear clawed at her throat, but determination drove her forward. She stepped onto the first stone, arms outstretched for balance. The water surged, splashing against her ankles. The second stone was slicker, the third narrower. She whispered prayers with each step, her rosary clutched tight in one hand. "Our Father, who art in heaven," her foot slipped. The world tilted. She gasped, arms flailing, bread and flask tumbling from her satchel. The roar of the river swallowed her cry as icy water dragged her under. The current spun her violently, pulling her downstream. She kicked, desperate, choking as water filled her lungs. Her veil tore away, vanishing in the darkness. The world blurred into panic water, stone, darkness. Her chest burned. She thought of the convent, of the cross she had left behind, of the vows broken and the shame that had driven her to flee. She thought, "This is my punishment. God delivers me to the river." Her strength gave out. Her limbs slowed. The current pulled harder. Just as the darkness pressed fully in, rough hands seized her arm. She gasped, half-conscious as her body was dragged toward shore. Her vision blurred with river spray and exhaustion, but she saw the outline of a man above her, a tall figure, dark hair, sharp eyes that glinted in the moonlight. Not a priest, not a Spaniard, an Apache. And then the world went black. The sound of rushing water still roared in her ears when Isabella opened her eyes. For a moment she thought she was still beneath the current, drowning, but the weight pressing on her chest was only the sodden cloth of her habit clinging to her skin. She coughed violently, river water spilling from her lips. Each breath a ragged gasp. "Breathe," a deep voice commanded. Her vision cleared enough to see the man crouched above her. The firelight from a small blaze flickered against his strong, angular features. Long black hair clung weightily to his shoulders. His eyes, dark and sharp, studied her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Isabella recoiled instinctively, scrambling back across the damp ground. The movement was clumsy, her limbs weak, but fear gave her strength. She had been taught since childhood to fear the Apache, the heathens who roamed the desert, enemies to the church and settlers alike. Yet here one knelt before her, the very man who had pulled her from the river's jaws. "Stay," he said simply, his voice low but firm. His Spanish was rough, accented, but clear enough. Isabella froze, clutching her rosary with trembling fingers. She realized then that they were alone. The river raged only yards away, its spray misting the air, but there was no convent wall to shield her, no familiar voice to offer guidance. "Only this man, you would be dead," he continued, gesturing toward the water. His gaze shifted back to her. "I pulled you out," the words struck her like a stone. It was true. She remembered the cold, the darkness, the final breath she thought would be her last. Then those hands, his hands, had dragged her free. Still, her fear fought against gratitude. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Why help me?" For a moment he said nothing. He only reached for a strip of cloth beside him, tearing it cleanly before offering it to her. She hesitated, then realized he meant for her to dry her bleeding hand, scraped raw from the rocks. "Why?" She pressed again, the question sharper this time. Born of both fear and confusion. At last, his eyes softened, though his face remained unreadable. "Because the river takes too many. I will not let it take you." His words left her speechless. She stared at him, uncertain whether to believe. This was not the cruelty she had been warned of. There was no savagery in his eyes, only quiet certainty. The fire crackled between them, sending sparks into the night. Isabella shivered, both from cold and from the strange awareness that settled in her chest. "This man, this Apache, had saved her life? My name is Taza," he said after a pause. As though deciding she had the right to know, she clutched her cloak tighter around her shoulders. "Isabella," she murmured, the syllables trembling as though giving her name was another kind of surrender. He nodded once, then returned to tending the fire, adding branches so the flames leapt higher. Warmth reached her gradually, easing the chill in her bones. She watched him work, his movements purposeful, practiced. He had no need to reassure her, yet each action spoke silently of care. Her thoughts churned. She had fled her convent believing the wilderness would devour her. Instead, she had been pulled from death by the very people she had been warned against. It felt as though God himself had played a cruel trick placing her fate in the hands of a man who embodied everything forbidden. The night deepened. The river raged on, but its sound became background to the silence that stretched between them. Isabella sat rigid, unwilling to close her eyes, though exhaustion weighed on her heavily. Taza remained alert, a shadow against the firelight, his gaze often shifting toward the trees as if expecting danger. Finally, her strength gave out. Her eyelids drooped despite her will. Before sleep claimed her, she whispered one last thought into the darkness. "I was supposed to die tonight. Why did he not let me?" The dawn broke pale and gray, mist clinging to the riverbank as Isabella stirred. For one precious moment she forgot where she was. She thought she was back in her narrow convent cell, waking to the toll of the bell and the whisper of prayer. But when she opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was not the stone ceiling of her chamber, but the wide, endless sky. And then she saw him. Taza stood near the water's edge. Bare-chested now, his skin bronzed by sun and scarred by battles she could only imagine. He crouched to refill a water skin, his movements measured, deliberate, silent. The sight made her catch her breath, and shame followed swiftly. She turned her gaze away, clutching her cloak as though it might shield her from the strangeness of the moment. Her convent training echoed in her head. A nun is a bride of Christ. She must guard her thoughts, her eyes, her very soul. Yet here she was, barefoot on a riverbank, heart racing because of a man she did not know. A man she was supposed to fear. The crunch of his footsteps drew closer. She looked up to find Taza standing over her, offering the water skin. "Drink," he said simply. Her hands trembled as she accepted it. The water was cool, fresh, and she drank deeply despite her suspicion. When she lowered it, she caught his gaze on her, steady, unreadable, but not unkind. "You walked into the river," he said, his Spanish slow but careful. "Why?" Isabella flinched. She wanted to tell the truth, but the words tangled in her throat. Could she admit she was a fugitive nun? That she had broken her vows and abandoned her sisters? That she had fled from something too heavy to confess? She shook her head instead, murmuring, "I slipped." His expression told her he did not believe it, but he did not press further. Instead, he gestured to the fire where he had laid strips of dried meat. "Eat?" Again she hesitated, and again hunger won over pride. The taste was strange, smoky, and unfamiliar, but it filled her stomach with strength she desperately needed. As she chewed, she studied him from the corner of her eye. Taza moved with a quiet authority, his every action controlled. He carried himself like a man used to command, yet there was no cruelty in his bearing. The contradiction unsettled her. She had been told men like him were wild, dangerous, incapable of mercy. But had such a man not saved her life when he could easily have let her drown? "Are you alone?" she asked at last, her voice low. He glanced at her, then toward the trees as if measuring how much truth to give. "Not for long. My people move nearby. I go to them soon." Her pulse quickened. If she was taken among his people, what would happen? Would she be a prisoner, a slave? Panic threatened to rise again, but something in his calm demeanor held it at bay. Taza crouched across from her, his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her breath falter. "You are not from here," he said. It was not a question, but a statement. She swallowed. "No." His gaze softened, though his tone remained firm. "Then you are hunted." The words struck too close to truth. Her throat tightened, and for a moment she thought she might weep. Instead, she lowered her eyes. Clutching her rosary in her palm until the beads bit into her skin, he said nothing more. But in his silence she felt something stronger than words, recognition. As though he too knew what it meant to be pursued, to carry secrets unspoken. The morning stretched into day, the sun burning off the mist. Isabella rose shakily, unused to such freedom of movement after years confined behind stone walls. Taza watched her but made no move to stop her. When she nearly stumbled on the uneven ground, he reached out instinctively. Steadying her with a hand on her arm, the contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through her body, leaving her breathless. His hand was calloused, firm, yet his touch was gentle, careful not to frighten her. For the first time since she had fled, Isabella felt a strange, fragile sense of safety. Not with the convent walls, nor the prayers of her sisters, but here in the wild, under the watchful eyes of a man she did not understand, and though she did not yet know it, the bond formed by that riverbank would bind them tighter than any vow ever could. By midday, the sun had turned harsh, baking the land until the air shimmered above the river rocks. Isabella's feet ached from walking barefoot. Her sandals had been torn away by the current. The earth cut into her tender solace, but she pressed on, stumbling to keep up with Taza's long, tireless stride. "Wait," she pleaded once, breathless. He stopped immediately, turning back with the same steady calm he always carried. "You cannot walk far like this." His gaze dropped to her feet, bleeding from sharp stones. Without hesitation, he reached into the leather pouch slung at his side, pulling out strips of soft hide before she could protest. He crouched and began to wrap her feet. Isabella stiffened, scandal rushing through her veins. A man touching her feet? In the convent, such contact would have been unthinkable. She should have pulled back, should have refused. Yet the warmth of his hands through the thin hide, the careful way he bound her wounds, stripped away her will to protest. He tied the makeshift moccasins with quiet efficiency, then rose as if nothing remarkable had passed between them. "Better," he said simply. Her lips parted, but no words came. She followed him in silence, unsettled by how his small mercies unraveled the walls she had spent years building. As the sun dipped lower, the land changed. The river wound into a canyon, its walls towering red and gold. Taza guided her to a narrow opening half hidden by brush. Inside, the air was cooler, the cave walls etched with old markings Isabella could not decipher. "Here," he said. "Safe, safe," the word echoed in her chest, strange and heavy. She had not felt safe even within the convent walls, where whispers of judgment followed her like shadows. Now, in a place carved by time and stone, she felt the first faint stirrings of it. Taza lit a small fire, the flames dancing against the rough walls. He laid out dried meat and ground maize, gesturing for her to eat. Hunger gnawed at her, but hesitation lingered. She watched him tear into his portion with ease, his movements practical, unbothered by silence. Finally, she picked up her food and ate. The quiet stretched between them until Isabella broke it. "You did not have to bring me here." Taza's eyes flicked up, dark and unreadable. "The desert at night kills? You are not strong enough to fight it." The words, blunt as they were, held no malice. Still, they stung. She lowered her gaze to the fire, ashamed. She had thought her prayers, her devotion, her vows would make her strong. Yet here she was, helpless, without a man she had been taught to fear. But then his voice softened, barely audible over the crackle of the flames. "Even the strong need shelter." Her eyes lifted, startled. For the briefest moment, his gaze caught hers. Something unspoken lingered there, a shadow she could not name. He looked away first, turning his attention to sharpening his knife. The night deepened. Outside, coyotes howled, their cries haunting the canyon walls. Isabella wrapped her cloak tighter, but the chill seeped through. She shivered. Without a word, Taza rose and pulled a buffalo hide from his pack, laying it across her shoulders. "Why?" She whispered again, the same question that had haunted her since he dragged her from the river. "Why help me?" This time, he answered without hesitation. "Because I know what it is to run." Her breath caught. She wanted to ask run from what? From whom? But the weight in his voice stopped her. There were secrets here, ones he was not yet ready to share. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the cave walls. Isabella lay on the hide, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing as he sat watch. Sleep tugged at her, though her heart was restless. She was a nun no longer, a fugitive now, and in the care of a man who carried his own fugitive silence. As her eyes closed, one thought circled in her mind. Perhaps God had not abandoned me after all. Perhaps he had sent me here to this man, this cave, this wilderness, for a reason I could not yet see. The cave was hushed except for the steady pop and crackle of the fire. Shadows leapt against the red stone walls, painting the chamber with restless shapes. Isabella sat close to the flames, her knees drawn to her chest, trying to ignore the way her heart hammered every time. Taza's dark eyes swept toward her. She had not spoken of her past to anyone, not even to herself, not in the prayers she once whispered in cold stone chapels. But now, the silence pressed upon her until it became unbearable. If she did not speak, she thought she might shatter. "I should not be here," she began softly, her voice trembling. Taza's head lifted. He was sharpening his blade with slow, even strokes, but he paused now, giving her his full attention. He said nothing, only waited. She closed her eyes, swallowing hard. "I was a nun. I took vows. Poverty, chastity, obedience." Each word fell like a stone from her lips, heavy and condemning. "And I broke them." Taza's expression did not change. He did not look shocked, nor did he sneer as she half expected. He simply listened, and in that silence, Isabella felt strangely compelled to continue. "There were whispers," she said, voice cracking. "They said my devotion was weak, that I questioned too much. The Mother Superior said doubt was the devil's breath inside me. Perhaps she was right. I began to wonder if the walls of the convent were built to keep us close to God or to keep us trapped, away from the world." Her throat tightened. "So I ran. I thought I could escape the weight of my vows, but now I am hunted, branded sinful, a fugitive." For a long moment, the only sound was the fire's steady hiss. Isabella dared not look up, ashamed of her confession. Finally, Taza spoke, his voice low and measured. "You ran from chains?" Her head snapped up, startled. Chains? His gaze was fixed on the blade in his hands, but his words were for her. Not all chains are iron. Some are words, promises, walls. The truth in his tone struck her like a blow. He understood. Somehow, he understood. She leaned forward, desperate. And you? What chains did you break? For the first time, a shadow passed over his features, dark and guarded. He placed the blade aside, his hands tightening briefly before he answered. I was taken once, he said quietly. As a boy, soldiers came, burned my village. They brought me to the mission. They cut my hair, put clothes on me that were not mine. Gave me a name that was not mine, Isabella's breath caught. She could see the memories flicker in his eyes, though his face remained hard. They said I belonged to their God. They made me kneel, made me repeat their prayers, taught me to read their words. For years I lived in their stone house with their crosses on every wall. I ate their bread, I sang their hymns, his lips pressed into a tight line. But inside I was still Taza, my blood still sang with the songs of my people. He fell silent, and the cave seemed to hold its breath. Isabella sat frozen, stunned by the revelation. A child taken from his people, raised in a world that sought to erase him. A boy forced to kneel where she herself had knelt. Slowly, she whispered, And you escaped? His eyes lifted, meeting hers with fierce intensity. Yes, I escaped. I ran back to my people, though the priest called me lost. But even here, among my own, the past follows. They look at me and see one who has eaten the bread of the white man, who knows the tongue of the enemy. To them, I am not fully theirs. To your people, I am not fully yours. I walk between two worlds, and I belong to neither. The words hung heavy between them. Isabella's chest ached. She had thought herself alone in her exile, a soul torn between devotion and freedom. Yet here was a man whose entire life had been a balancing act upon that very knife's edge, their eyes held across the fire, the flames flickering in the depths of his gaze. For the first time since fleeing the convent, Isabella did not feel entirely alone. The fire burned low, casting a soft orange glow against the walls of the cave. Isabella sat very still, her heart pounding as Taza's words echoed in her mind. I walk between two worlds, and I belong to neither. She longed to ask more, but fear held her back. The haunted edge in his voice warned her that pressing too far might close him off completely. Yet Taza surprised her. After a long silence, he spoke again, almost as if confessing to the fire instead of to her. When I escaped the mission, I thought I was free. His tone was steady, but underneath it she sensed a simmering bitterness. The freedom is not so simple. My people welcomed me, yes, but they looked at me differently. I knew prayers in the tongue of the Spanish. I could read their books, speak their words. Knowledge that should have made me strong instead made me suspect. He leaned back, his face half in shadow. Some call me useful, a bridge to the enemy. Others call me tainted. They whisper that I have the soul of a Spaniard hiding beneath my Apache skin. Isabella's breath caught. That is not true. His gaze flicked toward her, sharp and unreadable. And yet it follows me. Every time I walk into a council of warriors, I feel the weight of their eyes. They wonder if I will betray them. If the boy who wore the robe of the friar will return to his chains. Her chest tightened with a pang of recognition. She knew too well the sting of whispered judgment, the way suspicion clung no matter how deeply one prayed or confessed. But she hesitated, her voice trembling. You chose to return to your people. You chose to live as Taza. That must mean something. His jaw clenched. It means I walk with two shadows instead of one. For the first time, Isabella saw beyond his strong, unyielding exterior to the wound beneath the boy who had been torn from his family, forced into a faith not his own, then cast back into the world carrying both brands. Her fingers twisted in the fabric of her cloak. And if either side learns the truth? What would they do? Taza's silence was answer enough. The firelight caught the flicker of tension in his eyes, the slight tightening of his hands. Finally, he said, the Spaniards would kill me as a deserter. My people, he trailed off, exhaling heavily. They would see me as one who has lived too long in the enemy's shadow. Perhaps they would cast me out. Perhaps worse. A chill ran through Isabella despite the fire's warmth. His secret was more than shame, it was a death sentence. Suddenly, the sound of distant hoofbeats echoed faintly through the canyon. Both of them froze. Taza rose instantly, silent as a hunting cat, and slipped to the cave's mouth. Isabella followed, her heart in her throat. Outside, across the river, torches bobbed like fireflies in the distance. Voices carried on the wind harsh, commanding, unmistakably Spanish. Her blood ran cold. They were searching. For her, Taza's jaw hardened. They hunt, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Isabella pressed a hand to her mouth, panic clawing at her. If they find me, they will not. His tone was iron, but then his eyes flicked toward her, and she saw the fear he did not voice. If the soldiers came close enough, if they saw him, they might recognize him. The boy who once prayed in their chapels. The lost child who had slipped from their grasp. Her pulse thundered in her ears. If they knew, if they saw you, he cut her off with a sharp shake of his head. They must not. You understand? She nodded quickly, though her stomach twisted with dread. She had thought her own fugitive heart carried enough danger. Now she realized she was not the only one whose life could shatter if the Spaniards discovered the truth. As the torches faded into the distance, Taza returned to the fire, his face set in stone. Isabella followed, her mind a storm. She had run from vows she could not keep, but Taza carried the weight of two worlds on his shoulders. One word, one slip, and everything he had fought for would be lost. That night, as she lay awake beneath the buffalo hide, Isabella whispered a prayer not for herself, but for the warrior who had saved her life, whose forbidden secret bound them both in silence. Dawn broke pale and cold, spilling a thin light into the cave. Isabella stirred, her body stiff from sleep on the stone floor. For a moment she thought she had dreamed the night before the torches, the Spanish voices, the sharp intensity in Taza's eyes. But when she turned, she saw him crouched at the cave mouth, silent as a carved figure, scanning the canyon with an expression carved from iron. They've gone, he said finally. Though he didn't sound relieved. Isabella pushed herself upright, clutching the buffalo hide around her shoulders. They were looking for me, she whispered, ashamed to voice what both already knew. Taza glanced back, his gaze steady. And if they find you, they will not show mercy. Her throat tightened. She wanted to protest that she was no criminal, that she had only run because she could not bear the convent walls, but the memory of the soldiers. Harsh voices silenced her. Whatever the church had said about her absence, it had been enough to set men hunting. Taza turned back toward the canyon. You cannot return, he said simply. Not to them. Not now. The words fell like a stone in her chest. Part of her had clung to the thought that she might explain herself, beg forgiveness, perhaps be allowed back into holy service. But Taza's bluntness tore away that illusion. Then what am I? She murmured more to herself than to him. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he rose and walked deeper into the cave, gathering his few belongings. When he returned, he met her eyes. You are free, the word rang strange in her ears, heavy with both hope and terror. Free. She had dreamed of freedom while kneeling on the convent's cold stones, while scrubbing floors until her hands bled. She had longed to breathe without rules pressing down on her. Yet now that freedom was here, it felt like stepping into a void, endless and uncertain. Free, she repeated, her voice trembling. And yet hunted, Taza's mouth curved in the faintest shadow of a smile. That is what it means to walk between worlds. Neither side claims you. Both would punish you, her breath caught. Like you? For the first time, his eyes softened. He inclined his head, the smallest acknowledgement of the truth they now shared. The day wore on slowly. They stayed within the cave, Taza insisting it was too dangerous to move until nightfall. He showed her how to grind maize between stones, how to drink sparingly from a gourd of water, how to listen for the shift of wind that warned of approaching riders. Isabella found herself watching him, studying the way his hands moved with quiet certainty. There was a steadiness to him, as if no danger could shake the core of who he was, and yet, beneath that strength, She sensed a loneliness that mirrored her own. When the fire burned low again that evening, she gathered her courage. "Taza," she said softly, "do you regret it? Leaving the mission, returning to your people," his knife stilled in his hands. For a moment he was silent. Then he said, "I regret nothing." But regret and pain are not the same. His gaze lifted to hers, dark and searching. "Do you regret leaving your convent?" The question struck deep. She opened her mouth, then closed it, fumbling for words. "I regret that I could not be what they wanted. That I was weak? No." His voice was firm, sharper than she expected. "Not weak, honest. There is strength in leaving chains behind." Her throat tightened, and she blinked back sudden tears. In all her life, no one had spoken of her decision as anything but failure. Now here in the wilderness, a man marked by his own chains looked at her and saw not sin, but courage. The fire flickered between them, painting his face in warm light and shadow. Their eyes met and held, and in that silence, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, a bond that neither could deny. For the first time, Isabella no longer felt merely like a fugitive nun or a lost soul. She felt like someone who had been seen. Outside, the coyotes howled again. Danger still lingered, circling them both. But within the cave, a fragile trust had taken root, one born of shared exile, of secrets too heavy to carry alone. And with that trust came a terrifying thought. Perhaps freedom was not something to be endured alone. Night fell heavy across the canyon, the stars sharp against the black sky. Isabella huddled close to the fire, though her thoughts kept her colder than the air. Every whisper of wind sounded like footsteps. Every flicker of flame reminded her of the torches she had seen along the river. Tiazie sat a short distance away, silent, sharpening his blade. The metallic scrape carried through the cave like a heartbeat. His stillness was a comfort and a warning both. "They will come again," Isabella said quietly. He didn't look at her, but the steady motion of his hand faltered just slightly. "Yes," her chest tightened. "And if they find us, they will not." His voice was sharp, decisive, but she heard the weight beneath it. He was not only protecting her, he was protecting himself. One recognition, one careless word, and the Spaniards would brand him traitor. "Neither Apache nor Christian, only an outcast? Then what do we do?" She pressed, desperation bleeding into her tone. "Do we hide in this cave forever?" At last his eyes lifted to hers. In the firelight they glowed with an intensity that rooted her in place. "No, we cannot hide. The desert swallows those who only run." He rose and moved to the cave mouth, gesturing for her to follow. Outside, the canyon stretched wide beneath the stars. The river glimmered like a silver serpent, endless and untamed. "This world is vast," he said, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. "There are places where the Spaniards do not ride, where my people do not judge, where a woman can be more than a fugitive, and a man more than a shadow." She stared at him, her heart racing. "You mean we could go? Together?" For the first time since she met him, a faint smile touched his lips. "If you wish it? If you have the courage," her breath caught. The thought was terrifying, to leave behind the convent, the church, every scrap of identity she had clung to. But then, what was left of that life? Chains, whispered condemnations, the endless ache of never being enough. Here, in this wild land, she had been saved by a man who carried his own chains but refused to bow to them. Together, perhaps, they could carve a different path, one not written by priests or councils, but by their own choices. Slowly, Isabella nodded. "I will not go back." Her voice trembled, but the words rang true. "If freedom means walking into the unknown, then I will walk." Taza studied her for a long moment, as if weighing the truth in her words. Then he reached out, offering his hand. She placed hers in his, and for the first time since she had fled, she felt steady. The coyotes cried again in the distance, but their song no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like a challenge, a call to those who dared to live untamed. Behind them, the fire burned low. Ahead of them stretched a land vast and uncertain. Between them lay secrets and shadows. But together they carried something stronger than fear. Not nun, not outcast. Not Spaniard, not Apache. Two fugitives. Two souls reborn in the wilderness. And from that night forward, destiny would no longer be something given to them. It would be something they claimed.